Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the formidable world of medieval castles. Those stoic giants of stone that dot the European landscape, still standing centuries later. Imagine, if you will, the biting wind whipping around your face, the acrid smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies hanging heavy in the air. You're trudging through ankle-deep mud, your chainmail clinking with every exhausted step, shield arm aching, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Up ahead, a monstrous shadow looms, a colossal silhouette against the darkening sky. A medieval castle. Its walls seem to scrape the heavens, utterly unyielding, radiating an almost sentient menace. You probably won't survive this, but hey, at least you'll have a good story for the afterlife. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You see, for all the romantic notions we might have about knights and chivalry, the medieval period was fundamentally brutal. A time when power was often defined by who could build the biggest, baddest fortress. And that, my friends, brings us to our first secret weapon in the castle's arsenal. Its absolutely ruthless commitment to real estate. Medieval lords weren't just picking a scenic spot for their next TikTok backdrop, okay? They were conducting a master class in strategic geography. You wouldn't build your impenetrable stronghold in the middle of a perfectly flat, easily accessible field, would you? Unless you had a secret desire to host the world's largest, most destructive, and ultimately shortest-lived siege party. No, the whole point was to make your unwelcome guests feel, well, unwelcome. From the moment they even considered showing up. Think about it. The very foundation of a castle's strength often wasn't its stone, but the ground it stood upon. You're trying to attack this place, right? So, you find yourself at the base of a towering cliff, or perhaps wading through a treacherous, boggy marsh, or even worse, slogging your way up a steep, rocky hill. It's like trying to get to a high school reunion, where the address is somewhere near the top of Mount Everest. Bring your own oxygen. It's just not practical. Its reliance on natural defenses wasn't some happy accident. It was the cornerstone of medieval military architecture. Castles were deliberately sited on elevated ground, like hilltops, river bends, or even islands, making them inherently difficult to approach, let alone encircle and attack effectively. This high ground offered a distinct advantage to the defenders, providing excellent visibility over the surrounding landscape, allowing them to spot an approaching army hours or even days before they arrived. It also made scaling walls significantly harder, as attackers would already be exhausted from the climb, trying to maintain their balance while simultaneously dodging a hail of arrows and rocks. Now, common historical fact you'll encounter is that many early castles, especially in England and France, were built on existing Roman or Iron Age earthworks. Why reinvent the wheel when someone else already dug the really big hole for you? This wasn't just about saving labor. These sites had already proven their strategic value over centuries. They were often places that commanded important trade routes, river crossings, or vulnerable passes, making them ideal control points. So, you might think you're attacking a shiny new medieval marvel. But underneath all that dressed stone, you're actually up against millennia of strategic thinking. It's like discovering your seemingly modern smartphone is actually running on a rewired, super-efficient abacus. A slightly more quirky tidbit, some castles were built directly into natural caves or even atop volcanic plugs, making them appear to literally grow out of the earth. Imagine trying to undermine a castle whose foundations are literally magma-formed rock. You'd need a pickaxe made of pure determination and a very forgiving health and safety inspector. These extreme locations presented unique challenges for builders too, requiring ingenious engineering to integrate the artificial structures with the natural formations. But the defensive benefits were often considered worth the monumental effort. It's a bit like building your dream home inside a giant, slightly damp but incredibly secure boulder, and historians still argue whether the defensive advantages of a naturally strong site always outweighed the logistical challenges of building and supplying a castle in such a remote or difficult-to-access location. Was it truly more beneficial to build on a mountaintop, requiring immense effort to haul up every stone and every barrel of ale, versus a more accessible but less naturally protected spot? It's a bit like deciding whether to live in a mansion on a private island with no bridge or a slightly smaller house with reliable Amazon Prime delivery. Tough choices, right? But for the medieval lord, the calculation was simple. Inconvenience for you meant security for them. So, you've survived the treacherous approach. Perhaps you even managed not to twist an ankle on a misplaced rock or get swallowed by a suspiciously cheerful bog monster. Good for you. But now, as you stand there, muddy and slightly bewildered, you're faced with what's often considered the granddaddy of all early medieval fortifications, the motte-and-bailey castle. If you ever played with dirt and sticks as a kid and tried to build an epic fort, you basically understood the core concept. Just without the actual, death part. Imagine a towering mound of earth, sometimes natural, sometimes entirely man-made, scraped up by countless laborers, using nothing but shovels and sweat. This is your motte. On top of this artificial hill, a sturdy wooden tower, known as a keep or dungeon, would typically stand. This was the lord's residence, the final defensive stronghold, and probably the place where all the good snacks were kept, round the base of the motte, or sometimes adjacent to it, stretched a larger enclosed courtyard called the bailey. This area, often protected by a ditch and a wooden palisade, basically a fence made of really big, pointy sticks, housed the barracks, stables, workshops, and whatever passes for a medieval Starbucks. It was the bustling heart of the castle community, where daily life unfolded and where you, as an aspiring besieger, would ideally not want to be. The beauty of the motte-and-bailey was its relative simplicity and speed of construction. When William the Conqueror landed in England in 1066, he didn't waste time waiting for stonemasons to get their acts together. He needed defenses now. So, his men started digging and chopping. These castles could be erected in a matter of weeks or months using readily available materials like earth and timber. This rapid deployment allowed invaders to quickly secure conquered territory, establish control, and provide a safe haven for their troops. It's like popping up a really robust, albeit slightly flammable, flat-pack fortress. You get instant security, even if it does come with a nagging fire hazard. Now, a mainstream historical fact. The Doomsday Book, compiled in 1086, lists over 500 castles in England, the vast majority of which were motte-and-bailey designs. Shows just how integral these structures were to the Norman conquest and subsequent control of the realm. They were symbols of new authority, visible reminders to the local populace that things had changed and that the new boss was definitely not the old boss. They essentially said, "We're here, we're powerful, and we've got a very pointy stick." At the top of this hill, however, and here's a quirky tidbit, these wooden wonders, for all their speed and initial effectiveness, had a rather significant Achilles heel. Fire, a determined attacker with enough flaming arrows, or a well-placed torch could turn a proud wooden keep into a bonfire in relatively short order. Imagine the horror of trying to put out a timber castle fire with medieval bucket brigades. Yeah. It's less epic siege and more really, really bad campfire gone wrong. This inherent vulnerability was a major driving force behind the eventual shift to stone construction, which we'll get to shortly. It's a bit like buying a really fast car made entirely of papier-mâché. It's fun for a bit, but ultimately not very practical for long-term use. And speaking of practicality, historians still argue whether the initial decision to build timber castles was purely a matter of speed and resource availability, or if there was also a conscious understanding that these structures would serve as temporary fortifications until more permanent stone versions could be erected. Was it a planned two-stage process, or simply a build-it-now, fix-it-later mentality, born of necessity? It's a bit like that messy drawer of tools you've been meaning to organize for years. Was the initial disarray a temporary measure, or just pure chaos that somehow stuck around? Either way, for a good few centuries, if you wanted to besiege a castle, your primary weapon wasn't a giant rock-throwing machine, but a really enthusiastic pyromaniac, the motte itself. Being a big pile of dirt also presented its own set of challenges for both attackers and defenders. Attackers had to scramble up its steep slopes, often under a barrage of projectiles, making them incredibly vulnerable. Defenders, however, faced issues with erosion, especially in rainy climates, and the constant need to maintain the wooden structures atop a shifting earth mound. It was a constant battle against gravity and the elements, a bit like trying to keep a sandcastle perfect during high tide. But for the medieval age, it was a shockingly effective solution. A testament to the ingenuity of a time when brute force and clever positioning were the ultimate strategic tools. All right, you've witnessed the humble beginnings of castle architecture. Those timber titans that could pop up almost as fast as a pop-up ad on your screen, and almost as annoying to get rid of if you were on the wrong side of the palisade. But, as we learned, wood, for all its speed and convenience, had a rather fiery flaw. It turned out that medieval arsonists were shockingly effective. So, as lords and kings started thinking about their long-term property values and, not constantly having their homes go up in smoke, a rather brilliant, albeit much slower and more expensive idea took hold: stone. The transition from timber to stone wasn't a sudden overnight epiphany, like someone finally realizing that concrete was a better material for a swimming pool than a giant sponge. It was a gradual evolution, driven by the desire for greater permanence, security, and a healthy dose of my castle is bigger and harder to burn than yours one-upmanship. Picture the sheer scale of the undertaking: quarrying massive blocks of stone, transporting them often over considerable distances, and then painstakingly shaping and lifting them into place. This wasn't a DIY weekend project. This was essentially the medieval equivalent of building a pyramid, but with more pointy bits and fewer pharaohs. The sound of chisels ringing against rock, the groaning of ox carts laden with impossible weights, the constant cries of masons and laborers. It would have been an epic symphony of construction, and this shift brought about a monumental leap in defensive capability. Suddenly, fire arrows were about as effective as throwing a handful of glitter at a charging rhino. Battering rams still packed a punch, but they were now up against solid rock, not just a few planks of wood. Early stone castles, often built around or replacing existing motte-and-bailey structures, typically featured a sturdy rectangular stone keep or dungeon as their central strongpoint. These keeps were incredibly thick-walled, often with only a single, elevated entrance to make them even harder to breach. They were essentially fortified skyscrapers of their day, projecting an unmistakable message of permanence and power. A mainstream historical fact. One of the earliest and most iconic examples of a stone keep is the White Tower within the Tower of London, begun shortly after the Norman conquest. Its immense size and formidable construction were a clear demonstration of Norman authority and a grim warning to any who dared defy it. Imagine trying to knock down something that looks like it was designed by a grumpy giant who really hated visitors. It's a structure that still stands today, a testament to the incredible skill and sheer brute force of medieval engineering. Now for a quirky tidbit to make mortar. The sticky stuff that holds all those heavy stones together. Medieval builders often used surprisingly varied ingredients. While lime and sand were standard, there are accounts of everything from animal hair for tensile strength, apparently to blood, milk, and even urine being added. Yes, you heard that right. So, the next time you marvel at an ancient castle wall, just remember that somewhere deep within its stony heart, there might be traces of medieval dairy products or, shall we say, personal contributions. It really puts a new spin on the phrase built with blood, sweat, and tears, doesn't it? Though I suppose adding urine might make built with blood, sweat, tears, and a pressing need to find a restroom a more accurate, less poetic description, and this leads us to an enduring scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the initial design of these massive stone keeps was primarily focused on defense, making them virtually impregnable strongboxes, or if their imposing size and elaborate construction also served a significant purpose as a psychological deterrent and symbol of lordly power. Was the primary goal to keep people out, or to simply make people think they couldn't get in, thereby discouraging any attempts in the first place? It's a bit like buying an oversized, incredibly intimidating guard dog that's actually just a big softy inside. The perceived threat might be just as effective as the actual bite. But for medieval lords, projecting an image of unassailable strength was just as crucial as having the actual means to defend it. These early stone keeps were the ultimate flex, a literal monument to their owner's wealth, status, and frankly, their ego. Alright, so you've got your formidable stone keep, a giant middle finger to anyone thinking of starting a fire party. But as anyone who's ever tried to build a really good blanket fort knows, one solid wall isn't enough. You need layers. You need angles, and you need places to pop out and surprise your little brother with a Nerf dart. Medieval castle designers, though slightly less concerned with Nerf darts, understood this principle perfectly. This brings us to the ingenious evolution of curtain walls and towers. Imagine standing at the base of a truly massive stone wall. Not just a single barrier, but a vast encompassing ring of rock encircling the entire castle complex. This is the curtain wall, and it's not just there for show. These walls were built incredibly thick, sometimes 10 feet or more, designed to absorb the impact of siege engines and resist undermining attempts. But a flat, continuous wall, while impressive, still had a vulnerability if attackers managed to reach it. They could potentially scale it without facing too much direct fire from the defenders on the wall, lest the defenders leaned precariously over the edge. Not ideal, unless you're training for a medieval circus act. So, how did they fix this? With towers, my friends. Lots and lots of towers. These weren't just decorative bumps. They were strategically placed projections along the curtain wall, often at regular intervals or at vulnerable points. These towers served multiple crucial functions. Firstly, they broke up the straight lines of the wall, making it harder for besiegers to find continuous dead zones where they wouldn't be under attack. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, they allowed for flanking fire. Think of it this way. If you're trying to attack a wall directly, the defenders on that section can only shoot straight out. But if there's a tower just to your left and another to your right, suddenly you're being shot at from 3 directions. It's like being caught in the world's most dangerous crosswalk, with arrows and rocks instead of impatient taxi drivers. This ability to fire along the length of the wall is catching attackers in a devastating crossfire. It's made approaching the curtain wall a truly terrifying prospect. A mainstream historical fact. The concentric castle, a design perfected in the 13th century, exemplifies the ultimate development of curtain walls and towers. Castles like Caernarfon in Wales, built by Edward I, featured multiple rings of walls, each with its own series of towers, creating a formidable layered defense. If you somehow managed to breach the outer wall, you'd find yourself in a killing ground, trapped between the first and second walls, with defenders raining down projectiles from both sides. It was less a castle and more a very large, very aggressive stone onion, designed to make you cry, then likely perish. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some medieval towers weren't always perfectly round or square. Occasionally, you'd find D-shaped or even polyhedral towers. The D-shaped tower, for instance, offered a rounded face to absorb direct impacts from siege engines, deflecting blows more effectively than a flat wall, while still providing flat interior walls for ease of construction. And room layout. It's like the medieval equivalent of designing a car with a super aerodynamic front, but still keeping sensible square seats inside. Practicality and survivability, all rolled into one slightly odd-looking package. And here's where historians still argue was the primary purpose of designing taller, more elaborate towers simply to provide better firing platforms. Or was there also a significant element of prestige and visible power projection at play? Did the Lord want his towers to be effective, or did he want them to be impressive, even if the extra height didn't offer a proportional increase in defensive capability? It's a bit like deciding if you want your super fast gaming PC to actually be fast, or if you just want it to have really cool RGB lighting that makes it look fast. For medieval lords, the lines between practical defense and ostentatious display were often delightfully and expensively blurred. But for you, the poor soul trying to get inside, those towers were a clear signal. Turn back now, or face a very bad day. So, you've somehow navigated the murderous crossfire from the curtain walls and towers. Perhaps by adopting an awkward arrow-dodging dance routine, or maybe you just got lucky. You're feeling pretty pleased with yourself, aren't you? You've reached the very threshold of the castle, the main entrance. You might even be thinking, aha, just push this giant wooden door, and I'm in. Oh, my sweet naive besieger, how wrong you are. Because you are now standing before what became one of the most diabolically clever, utterly lethal, and surprisingly complex pieces of medieval engineering. The GATEHOUSE. Forget your friendly neighborhood front door with a doorbell and a welcome mat. The medieval gatehouse was less an entrance and more a death trap, meticulously designed to funnel attackers into a confined kill zone meat grinder. It wasn't just a gate, it was a fortress within a fortress, often as strong or even stronger. Then the main curtain wall. Early gatehouses might have been simple archways with a wooden door and a portcullis that heavy, spiked metal or wooden grill that could be dropped down to block the entrance. But as siege technology advanced, so did the gatehouse's complexity, evolving into a multi-layered, multifunctional defensive marvel. Imagine this. You approach what looks like the main gate, perhaps a formidable archway. But as you step under it, you realize you're not instantly inside. Instead, you're in a narrow, enclosed passage, effectively a stone corridor. Above you, murder holes. Small openings in the ceiling allow defenders to pour down boiling water, hot sand, surprisingly effective for getting into armor cracks, apparently. Rocks, or anything else unpleasant they could get their hands on. It's like a medieval car wash, but instead of soap and water, you get agony and despair. Ahead, there's another gate. And behind you, the first gate clangs shut, trapping. This, my friend, is the kill zone or death trap. And you are now the unhappy mouse in a very large, very stone mousetrap. A mainstream historical fact. Concentric castles, which we touched upon earlier, often featured incredibly elaborate gatehouses. Beaumaris Castle in Wales, another of Edward I's masterpieces, boasts a gatehouse so complex that it virtually functioned as a self-contained keep. It had multiple portcullises, heavy wooden doors, arrow loops, murder holes, and even living quarters for the gate guard. It was designed to withstand a siege, even if the rest of the castle fell, a truly terrifying proposition for any attacking force. It's like trying to break into a bank vault that also doubles as a fully armed police station. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some gatehouses featured intricate, maze-like approaches or barbicans, outer fortified gateways, designed to force attackers to expose their flanks or turn their backs to defenders. Imagine trying to charge a gate only to find yourself forced to make a sharp right turn, then a sharp left, all while being peppered with arrows. It's less a direct assault and more a medieval assault course designed by a particularly sadistic gym teacher. This also meant that siege engines, which typically needed a clear, straight run-up, often couldn't even get close enough to effectively damage the gate. And here's where historians still argue. It's the primary innovation in gatehouse design driven by defensive necessity against ever-improving siege engines. Or was it also a reflection of the increasing sophistication of military architecture as a whole, a sort of medieval arms race between offense and defense? Did they build these complex gatehouses because they absolutely had to, or because they could, and it looked really impressive? It's like arguing whether a car company adds a new safety feature because of government regulations, or because they want to brag about it in commercials. Either way, for the poor soul attempting to force entry, the gatehouse was a terrifying gauntlet designed to break both their will and their bones. You might have made it this far, but getting through that? Well, let's just say your chances are about as good as finding a quiet moment on a medieval battlefield. So, you've somehow navigated the murder holes and avoided being impaled by a descending portcullis. Perhaps you even managed to charm a grumpy gate guard with a dazzling smile. Unlikely. But hey, a besieger can dream. But now, you step out of the gatehouse's clutches, only to be met with ... nothing. Well, not nothing, but a rather significant, rather wet, and rather deep ditch. Welcome to the world of moats and water defenses, where the castle builders decided that a good offense often involved making you incredibly soggy and then really, really dead. A moat wasn't just a fancy, decorative pond for the Lord's pet ducks. It was a critical, active, defensive barrier. Imagine trying to charge a castle, fully armed and armored, only to find yourself facing a gaping trench, often V-shaped, and anywhere from 10 to 60 feet wide, sometimes even more. And then, just to make things interesting, they'd fill it with water. This wasn't just for a dramatic effect, although it certainly added to the castle's intimidating aura. The water itself presented a formidable obstacle. You couldn't just run across it. You couldn't easily bring up siege towers or battering rams, which relied on flat, stable ground. It's trying to swim across in full armor, less heroic. Charge and more, very effective way to drown slowly. The primary purpose of the moat was to keep heavy siege equipment, like those massive battering rams or towering siege engines, at a safe distance from the castle walls. It's like trying to parallel park a monster truck in a kiddie pool. It's just not going to happen gracefully. Even if you tried to fill the moat, say, with earth and rubble, it would be an incredibly slow, exposed, and dangerous task, all while defenders rain down projectiles from the safety of the walls. Plus, if the castle had a river diverted to fill the moat, they could potentially flush away your hard-won fill material with a simple release of a sluice gate. Talk about feeling like your efforts are being literally washed away. A mainstream historical fact. Concentric castles, again, often made excellent use of moats, sometimes even having multiple moats for different rings of defense. Caerphilly Castle, in Wales, for instance, is famously surrounded by an extensive system of artificial lakes and waterways, making it one of the most formidable water-defended castles in Europe. Its watery defenses were so vast and complex that it was virtually impossible to besiege effectively without first controlling the water flow, which was no easy feat. It's less a moat and more an entire aquatic park designed to prevent unwelcome guests. Now for a quirky tidbit. While Hollywood often depicts moats as teeming with crocodiles, sharks, or other exotic beasts, the reality was a bit more mundane. Most moats simply contained whatever local wildlife decided to move in. Probably lots of frogs, some fish, and maybe a grumpy otter or two. However, there are scattered, mostly anecdotal accounts of defenders occasionally throwing in sharp stakes, broken glass, or even dead animals to make crossing even more unpleasant and unsanitary. So, while you might not have faced a dragon in the moat, you might have faced an angry, disease-ridden badger. Not quite as cinematic, but definitely still a deterrent. It's like arriving at a pool party only to find out it's filled with lukewarm dishwater and some suspicious floating objects, and historians still argue whether the defensive benefits of a water-filled moat truly outweighed the significant effort and resources required to construct and maintain them, particularly in areas without natural water sources or where diverting rivers was a monumental task. Was it always a net gain, or sometimes an extravagant display that offered diminishing returns? It's like arguing whether owning a super expensive water-cooled gaming PC is truly better than a slightly cheaper air-cooled one, when both essentially do the same job. But for the medieval lord, the visual deterrent of a wide, shimmering moat reflecting the imposing walls probably felt worth every drop of sweat and every penny spent. It screamed, "Don't even think about it." Alright, you've somehow bypassed the aquatic defenses, perhaps by inventing a medieval hovercraft, or maybe you just got lucky and found a really big, conveniently placed log. You're now, theoretically, standing on solid ground again, looking up at those formidable stone walls. But as you squint against the sun, you notice something else glinting menacingly in the distance. Something huge and wooden and utterly terrifying. This, my friend, is where you truly appreciate the castle's strength. Because the existence of these stone fortresses directly fueled the terrifying innovations in siege weaponry's rise. The medieval period was a constant arms race. As castles got stronger, so did the tools designed to knock them down. It's like if your neighbor gets a bigger, more intimidating dog, so you decide to invest in an even bigger, more intimidating fence. And then they get a better dog treat dispenser, so you upgrade your security cameras. It's a never-ending cycle, but with considerably more danger and less dog-related cuteness. For centuries, castles were the ultimate defensive strongholds. But determined attackers weren't just going to pack up their bags and go home because you had a really thick wall. They brought out the big guns, or rather, the big ropes, levers, and counterweights. One of the most iconic and devastating siege weapons was the trebuchet. Forget your paltry catapults. The trebuchet was the king of medieval artillery. Till this wasn't some flimsy slingshot. It was a gigantic, counterweight-powered behemoth, capable of launching massive projectiles, anything from rocks weighing hundreds of pounds to flaming bundles of pitch, diseased animal carcasses, more on that, delightful tactic later, or even, supposedly, dismembered heads of enemies, just to really set the mood. The sheer kinetic energy generated by these machines was immense, capable of battering down sections of walls over time. Imagine a giant's arm relentlessly flinging building-sized boulders at your house, day after day. It's less a battle and more a very slow, very destructive demolition derby, a mainstream historical fact. The trebuchet saw its peak use from the 12th to the 15th centuries. One of the most famous examples of its destructive power was during the siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, when Edward I of England, yes, him again, always building and destroying things, ordered the construction of a colossal trebuchet named Werewolf. It reportedly took 5 master carpenters and 50 laborers 3 months to build and was so powerful that its first few shots reportedly flattened a significant portion of the castle wall, leading to the castle's surrender. Imagine that moment. Oh, look, they're building a really big. Oh wait, that's not good. Now for a quirky tidbit. While trebuchets were primarily used for launching destructive projectiles, they were occasionally used for less conventional and frankly, gross purposes. There are accounts of trebuchets being used to hurl beehives over castle walls to cause chaos among the defenders or even bags of human excrement. 'Cause nothing says we really want you to surrender like a giant poop missile. It's a rather effective form of psychological warfare, isn't it? Imagine being a knight on the walls, bravely defending your home, only to be showered in. Well, you get the picture. Makes you question if those fancy suits of armor really offered full protection. And historians still argue whether the development of these increasingly powerful siege engines was a direct response to the thicker, more resilient stone walls, or if advances in engineering and mechanics would have led to their creation regardless of castle design. Was it an evolutionary arms race where one innovation begot another? Or was it simply inevitable that someone would figure out how to throw a really big rock really far? It's like arguing whether smartphones got smaller because people wanted them to fit in their pockets, or if miniaturization technology just happened to coincide with that desire. Either way, for the defenders inside the castle, the sight of these monstrous machines being assembled outside their walls was a truly chilling sight, a clear signal that the enemy meant business. And that business involved a lot of very large, very fast rocks heading their way. So, you've survived the terrifying barrage of oversized rocks and, perhaps, the occasional aerial delivery of unpleasant organic matter. Good for you, okay? But the besiegers, ever persistent, aren't just relying on smashing their way in from above. Sometimes, the most insidious threats come from below. Welcome to the dark, claustrophobic, and often deadly world of tunneling and undermining. This tactic was the medieval equivalent of trying to hack into a fortress's mainframe, only instead of code, you're using pickaxes, and instead of a computer virus, you're trying to collapse an entire wall. Imagine being a medieval miner. But instead of digging for gold or coal, you're digging towards a wall that people are actively trying to kill you from. It's not exactly a career path that screams long-term health benefits. Undermining involves skilled laborers, often actual miners, digging tunnels beneath the castle walls or towers. The goal was to create a void beneath the foundations, weakening the structure until it collapsed under its own immense weight. It's like playing Jenga, but with actual stone blocks. And the stakes are considerably higher than just losing a game night. The process was excruciatingly slow and incredibly dangerous. The tunnels had to be shored up with timber props as they progressed to prevent them from collapsing prematurely on the diggers. Ventilation was a constant issue, with stale air, carbon dioxide from lamps, and the sheer claustrophobia making the work almost unbearable. And then there was the ever-present risk of hitting bedrock, or worse, hitting water and flooding the tunnel. Imagine being knee-deep in freezing water, in pitch darkness, knowing that the entire castle above you could come crashing down at any moment. You'd probably prefer the giant poop missiles at that point. Once a sufficient void was created under the wall, The timber prop supporting the tunnel ceiling would be set on fire. The idea was that as the timbers burned away, the earth and stone above would lose their support, causing the section of the wall or tower to crumble, creating a breach. This was a moment of immense tension for both sides. The besiegers would be waiting anxiously for the collapse, while the defenders, if they detected the tunneling, would be scrambling to counter it. A mainstream historical fact, one of the most successful and well-documented instances of undermining occurred during the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215. It's undertaken by King John. His forces reportedly used the fat of 40 pigs, yes, 40 pigs, to fuel the fire in a mine tunnel, causing a section of the massive keep to collapse. The sheer audacity of using pig fat for incendiary purposes still makes you wonder about the medieval waste, not philosophy. It was a brutal but effective tactic that showcased the relentless ingenuity of besieging forces. Now, for a quirky tidbit, defenders were not entirely helpless against tunneling. They employed several countermeasures. Sometimes they would dig countermines, listening for the sounds of enemy digging and then attempting to intercept the enemy tunnel. If they succeeded, it would often lead to brutal close quarters underground. Combat fought with daggers and short swords in the dark, cramped confines of the tunnels. It's like a medieval horror movie in real time, with the added bonus of imminent structural collapse. Other times, they would flood the enemy tunnels or even try to smoke them out. Imagine being trapped in a tunnel filling with smoke. Definitely not a good day at the office, and historians still argue whether the effectiveness of undermining was more dependent on the skill and perseverance of the miners, or on the geological conditions of the castle site. Was it always a viable option, or did certain types of bedrock or water tables render it impractical, forcing attackers to rely on other methods? It's like arguing whether a successful heist is more about the cleverness of the plan or the security flaws of the bank. Either way, for the defenders, the constant threat of a subterranean assault added another layer of anxiety to the already stressful experience of being besieged. A nagging fear that the ground beneath your feet could literally betray you at any moment. You've dodged the trebuchet projectiles, narrowly escaped a subterranean collapse, and now find yourself looking rather disheveled, but still miraculously alive. You might think, surely, they've run out of ways to kill me. But that, my friend, is where the true medieval genius of endurance comes into play. Because conquering a castle wasn't just about direct assault. It was often a grueling test of wills, logistics, and stomach capacity. This brings us to the agonizing, drawn-out reality of supply lines and logistics. See, castle, especially a well-stocked one, wasn't just a building. It was a self-contained ecosystem designed to resist the outside world for as long as humanly possible. And conversely, a besieging army, no matter how large or mighty, was a hungry, thirsty, and often very grumpy beast that needed constant feeding. Imagine trying to feed an entire small city of soldiers, plus their horses, plus their camp followers, all without modern refrigeration or express delivery. It's less military campaign and more world's most stressful outdoor catering event. 4. The besiegers maintaining their supply lines was a logistical nightmare. They needed constant fresh water, food for thousands of men and animals, timber for siege engines, arrows, spare parts, and, crucially, beer because morale, people. This meant setting up a vast network of wagons, roads, and protection for these convoys. Any disruption to these lines, whether by bad weather, enemy raids, or just the sheer inefficiency of medieval transportation, could cripple the siege. Imagine waiting for your essential supplies, only to find out the medieval Amazon delivery driver got stuck in a mud bog for 3 weeks. Or worse, was ambushed by a band of very unchivalrous bandits who were more interested in your oat rations than your noble cause. For the defenders inside the castle, the strategy was simpler. Hoard everything. Castles were provisioned for months, sometimes even a year or more, in anticipation of a siege. They'd store enormous quantities of grain, salted meat, dried fish, barrels of ale, and wine again. Morale? Huh? And of course, plenty of fresh water. From wells or cisterns within the walls. The ability of a castle to hold out was often directly tied to its capacity for storage and its access to reliable water. A well-stocked larder and a deep well were often more valuable than an extra layer of wall, a mainstream historical fact. The Siege of Acre in 1189 to 1191. During the Third Crusade is a stark example of a siege turning into a logistical nightmare for both sides. Lasting over 2 years, it involved massive armies and navies, with both Crusaders and Muslim forces struggling with supply issues, disease, and morale. The scale of the operation was immense, and the need for constant resupply from Europe by sea was critical for the Crusaders. It showcased that even with overwhelming numbers, a siege could fail if the logistical chain broke down. It was essentially a very long, very bloody game of who runs out of snacks first. Now for a quirky tidbit, while food and water were paramount, other supplies were also crucial. Castles needed huge quantities of raw materials for repairing damage. More stone, more timber, and endless amounts of quicklime for mortar. They also needed vast supplies of arrows, bolts for crossbows, and even specialized materials for siege engines like rope, pitch, and animal sinew. Imagine needing to order 10,000 arrows and realizing you're out of feather fletchings. It's the medieval equivalent of trying to print an important conchment and realizing you're out of ink. And historians still argue whether the ultimate success or failure of a medieval siege was more often determined by the besiegers' ability to maintain their supply lines or the besieged's ability to simply outlast them with their stored provisions. Was it a race to starve the other side out, or a test of who could endure the logistical grind the longest? It's a bit like debating whether winning a marathon is more about how fast you run or how well you hydrate. But for the men on both sides, the rumbling of their stomachs often spoke louder than any general's commands, and the endless wait for supplies was a torment all its own. So you've realized that starvation is a far more likely outcome than a swift, glorious victory. And your stomach is starting to complain in a language that sounds suspiciously like "where's the beef?" But even if you somehow manage to cut off the castle's external supplies, you're still up against one of the most critical, yet often overlooked, elements of its defense: the garrison and morale. Because a castle, no matter how well built or well stocked, is ultimately just a very impressive pile of rocks without the people inside it. The size and quality of a castle's garrison varied wildly, from a handful of knights and their retainers in smaller strongholds to hundreds of soldiers in major royal fortresses. These weren't just random dudes with swords. They were professional soldiers, archers, crossbowmen, and experienced men-at-arms, trained to defend. Their lives literally depended on their ability to fight as a cohesive unit. Imagine trying to get a group of tired, hungry people to work together under extreme pressure. It's a miracle they managed it at all. It's probably fueled by copious amounts of low-quality ale and the sheer terror of what happened if they failed. But beyond mere numbers, the morale of the garrison was absolutely paramount. An highly motivated garrison could hold out against vastly superior numbers for months, even years. They were fighting for their lives, their families who were often sheltering within the castle walls, their lord, and sometimes for the sheer, stubborn pride of not giving up. Imagine being holed up in a confined space, under constant threat, with no escape. Your mental fortitude would be tested in ways you can barely imagine. It's less a military exercise and more a very extended, very high-stakes therapy session, where the only coping mechanism is don't die. The commander of the castle, often the lord himself or a trusted castellan, played a crucial role in maintaining this morale. They had to be tactically astute, understanding how to deploy their limited forces effectively, where to concentrate their fire, and when to launch a desperate sally, a surprise attack from the castle. But they also had to be psychologists, inspiring hope, quashing dissent, and ensuring that everyone felt their contribution was vital. A good leader could turn a desperate situation into a legend of heroic resistance. A bad one could see his garrison mutiny or surrender at the first sign of trouble. A mainstream historical fact: the Siege of Kenilworth Castle in 1266 is an incredible example of how a determined garrison could defy overwhelming odds. The castle, held by rebels against King Henry III, withstood a siege for 6 months, despite being attacked by royal forces using every siege engine known at the time. The defenders only surrendered due to starvation and disease, not from a breach in the walls. It's a testament to the sheer resilience and determination of the men inside. A real-life example of never give up, never surrender. Now, for a quirky tidbit. To keep morale up during long sieges, defenders sometimes resorted to creative psychological tactics. There are accounts of garrisons pretending to have an abundance of food by throwing a few loaves of bread or a side of beef over the walls to show they had plenty to spare, even when they were secretly starving. Imagine being the poor soldier told to hurl your last piece of edible protein over the wall, hoping the enemy falls for your bluff. It's the medieval equivalent of flexing your non-existent bank account to scare off a debt collector. And sometimes it actually worked. And historians still argue whether the loyalty of a garrison was primarily driven by feudal obligations and the fear of consequences, or if a sense of shared purpose, camaraderie, and a belief in their cause played a more significant role in their endurance. Was it fear of their lord that kept them fighting, or a genuine desire to protect their home and honor? It's like arguing whether a sports team wins because of strict coaching or genuine team spirit. Either way, for the besiegers outside, understanding the resolve of the men within was just as important as understanding the strength of the stone. Because a castle's true power often lay not in its unyielding walls, but in the unyielding hearts of its defenders. All right? You've realized that the castle's occupants are surprisingly stubborn and aren't about to give up, just because you've thrown a few rocks and a dead badger their way. But while the defenders are busy being stoic and surprisingly well-fed, another, far more insidious enemy begins to creep into both camps. This, my friends, is the invisible, microscopic, and utterly merciless foe: disease and starvation. Because even if you can't breach the walls, can always wait for biology to do the dirty work for you, for the besiegers. A long siege was often a breeding ground for sickness. Imagine thousands of men crammed together in temporary camps, often in unsanitary conditions, without proper sanitation, access to clean water, or good medical care. Add in the stress, the exhaustion, and a diet that probably consisted of hardtack and whatever unfortunate animals wandered too close to camp, and you've got a recipe for a disaster. Dysentery, typhoid, smallpox, and various fevers could sweep through an army like wildfire, decimating their numbers faster than any trebuchet. It was less glorious battle and more mass medieval tummy ache that turned fatal. Many sieges were abandoned not because of a successful defense, but because the attacking army simply withered away from illness. For the defenders inside the castle, the situation was often equally grim, if not worse. While they might have initially been well-provisioned, prolonged confinement, often with inadequate ventilation, poor hygiene, and a dwindling supply of fresh food, quickly took its toll. Food spoilage was a major issue. Imagine trying to keep meat fresh 4 months without refrigeration. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, would weaken men, making them vulnerable to other infections. Water supplies, though often from a well, could become contaminated if the well was shallow, or if the besiegers managed to pollute external sources. The castle could become a giant stone petri dish. This grim reality meant that a siege wasn't just a test of military might, but a brutal war of attrition against the human body. The side that could endure the longest, resist the spread of illness, and stretch their dwindling resources further, often emerged victorious, or at least survived. It's like a medieval version of Survivor, but instead of immunity idols. You're hoping your drinking water isn't full of tiny, deadly creatures. A mainstream historical fact. One of the most famous examples of disease impacting a siege occurred during the Siege of Harfleur in 1415. During the 100 Years' War, the English army, led by King Henry V, eventually captured the town, but at a terrible cost. Dysentery ravaged his forces, killing a significant portion of his men and weakening the rest, contributing to the famous Band of Brothers mentality at Agincourt, where they were severely outnumbered but driven by desperation. It was a victory, but one that came with a truly disgusting and deadly price tag. Now, for a quirky tidbit, while disease was often an accidental byproduct of siege conditions, there are scattered accounts of early crude attempts at biological warfare. The Mongols, for example, are famously and horrifyingly rumored to have catapulted plague-infested corpses over the walls during the walls. During the siege of Kaffa in 1346, while the direct effectiveness of this tactic in spreading the Black Death is debated, the psychological impact alone would have been utterly terrifying. Imagine seeing a decaying body hurtling towards your walls. Suddenly, Trebuchet Rock seems almost friendly, and historians still argue whether the devastating impact of disease during sieges was primarily due to the poor understanding of hygiene and sanitation in the medieval period, or if the sheer concentration of people in confined spaces, both inside and outside the walls, made such outbreaks inevitable, regardless of medical knowledge. Was it a fundamental lack of understanding, or simply an unavoidable consequence of medieval warfare? It's a bit like debating whether traffic jams are caused by bad driving or too many cars on the road. Either way, for the men caught in a prolonged siege, the most formidable enemy was often not the knight with the sword, but the invisible microbes festering in the muck beneath their feet. Sweet dreams, right? So, you've battled the elements, the fortifications, and even microscopic invaders. But the human mind, even in the medieval era, was a battlefield all its own. Because while you're focused on literal warfare, both sides were also engaged in a sophisticated game of cat and mouse, a constant ebb and flow of bluffs, threats, and attempts to break the opponent's spirit. This brings us to the fascinating, sometimes hilarious, sometimes truly chilling realm of psychological warfare. Remember, medieval warfare wasn't just about smashing things. It was also about convincing your enemy that continuing to resist was utterly futile. For the besiegers, this meant projecting an aura of overwhelming power and inevitability. They would parade their troops, showcasing their vast numbers, hoping to intimidate the defenders. They might construct ever larger and more menacing siege engines, not just for their destructive capability, but for the sheer visual terror they inspired. Imagine seeing a truly colossal trebuchet being assembled outside your walls, a monstrous wooden skeleton rising against the sky. You'd probably start questioning your life choices, wouldn't you? The psychological tactics could get quite theatrical. Besiegers might loudly proclaim their intentions to show no quarter if the castle resisted too long, threatening massacre or enslavement. They might send heralds to demand surrender, often with incredibly flowery but threatening language designed to sow doubt and fear. And then, of course, there were the less subtle methods, like parading captured prisoners within sight of the walls, or even, as we grimly noted, catapulting their remains into the castle. It's a bit like a medieval marketing campaign, only instead of buy one get one free, it's surrender now or face a truly miserable end. For the defenders, psychological warfare was equally vital, especially when outnumbered. Their goal was to project an image of impregnable strength, unwavering resolve, and seemingly endless resources, even if their last meal was a slightly moldy crust of bread and a sip of questionable water. They might sally forth, make a quick, surprise attack to inflict casualties and show they weren't afraid. They would repair breaches in the walls with frantic speed, demonstrating their determination. They might even taunt the besiegers, shouting insults and mocking their lack of progress. Imagine being on the walls, tired and hungry, and suddenly being asked to deliver a perfectly crafted insult to thousands of armed men. Talk about pressure, a mainstream historical fact. During the siege of Orleans in 1428 to 1429, Joan of Arc famously used psychological warfare to great effect. Her arrival significantly boosted French morale, while her confident pronouncements and bold actions deeply unnerved the English besiegers. They began to believe she was divinely inspired. She reportedly sent letters to the English commanders, demanding they retreat, and even challenged them to a duel. Her presence, more than any specific military tactic, shifted the tide of the siege by inspiring hope on one side and fear on the other. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest weapon is belief. Now for a quirky tidbit. Medieval castles sometimes had very specific architectural features designed for psychological effect. Loopholes for archers, for example, were often narrow on the outside, but splayed wide on the inside. This was not only practical for the archer, giving them a wider field of fire, but from the outside, it made the wall look impossibly thick and the openings impossibly small, creating an illusion of invulnerability. Imagine trying to hit a tiny slit from a distance while knowing a deadly arrow could emerge from it at any moment. It's like trying to win a staring contest with a house that's actively trying to kill you. And historians still argue whether the effectiveness of medieval psychological warfare was primarily dependent on the credulity and superstition of the average soldier, or if it tapped into universal human fears and anxieties that remain relevant even today. Was it a trick that only worked on uneducated peasants? Or was it a genuinely potent tool that could sway the course of a battle for anyone? It's like debating whether advertising works because people are gullible or because it taps into genuine desires. Either way, for the men enduring the siege, the whispers of doom or the shouts of defiance were often as loud and as impactful as the clash of steel. So, you've spent weeks, maybe months, staring at this defiant pile of rocks, enduring rocks, disease, and the occasional flying carcass. Your supplies are dwindling, morale is dipping, and your socks haven't been truly dry since you left home. Just when you're about to throw your hands up in despair and declare, "I'm just going home to plant some turnips," a new hope sometimes flickered into existence for the besieged, the potential arrival of relief armies. This was the ultimate wild card, the deus ex machina of medieval sieges. And its mere possibility could shift the entire dynamic of the conflict. Imagine being a defender inside the castle, living on rations that taste suspiciously like boiled boots, listening to the constant thud of trebuchets and the jeers of the besiegers. You're cold, you're hungry, and you're starting to wonder if this whole night thing was really the best career choice. Then, a messenger bird arrives, or a daring scout makes it through the enemy lines, bringing whispers of an approaching army, your king, your allies. Perhaps even a distant cousin with a surprisingly large number of loyal swordsmen. Suddenly, that moldy crust tastes a little better, and the thought of surrender evaporates. Hope, my friends, is a powerful motivator for the besiegers. The news of a relief army was the absolute worst kind of medieval alarm bell. It meant their comfortable siege camp was about to become a battlefield, okay? And they would be caught between the castle garrison sallying out and a fresh, potentially larger, army attacking from their rear, okay? This hammer and anvil situation was a commander's nightmare. They would suddenly have to make a difficult choice: abandon the siege and retreat, or prepare for a pitched battle, often from a disadvantageous position. It's like trying to perfectly roast a chicken, only to find out your in-laws are arriving with their own turkey and demanding you cook that instead. Right now, in your tiny oven, the approach of a relief army often forced the besiegers to lift the siege entirely, even if they were on the verge of victory. Why? Because losing a battle in the field, with their supply lines exposed and their army potentially shattered, was a far greater catastrophe than merely failing to take a castle. A king could always come back later for the castle, but rebuilding an army took years, sometimes generations. The psychological pressure on the besiegers, knowing that they might soon be fighting on two fronts, was immense. A mainstream historical fact. The relief of Orleans in 1429, spearheaded by Joan of Arc, is arguably the most famous example of a relief army completely transforming the course of a siege. Her arrival and subsequent actions not only broke the siege, but also turned the tide of the 100 Years' War in favor of the French. The English, despite having besieged the city for months, abandoned their positions and retreated when faced with the renewed French offensive. Was a dramatic demonstration that even the most determined siege could be undone by the timely intervention of outside forces. Now, for a quirky tidbit. Sometimes, the mere rumor of a relief army was enough to cause panic and disruption among besiegers, even if no such force actually existed. Defenders might send out false messengers or light signal fires to suggest an approaching army, hoping to trick the enemy into breaking the siege or at least diverting resources. It's like a medieval game of telephone, but with life or death, consequences, and a high chance of misinformation. A very effective bluff could save a castle, without a single sword being drawn in its defense. And historians still argue whether the concept of a relief army encouraged a more passive, defensive strategy from besieged garrisons, or if the hope of rescue actually emboldened them to resist more fiercely, knowing there was an end in sight. Did it make them fight harder, or just wait longer? It's a bit like debating whether knowing your Uber is 5 minutes away makes you more patient or just more agitated. Either way, for both attacker and defender, the distant murmur of an approaching army was the sound of fate turning, a dramatic crescendo in the deadly symphony of a medieval siege. You've made it this far, surviving the strategic positioning, the motte-and-bailey, the stone revolution, the gatehouse gauntlet, the moats, the trebuchets, the tunnels, the starvation, the disease, the psychological mind games, and even the looming threat of relief armies. Your medieval life expectancy should be setting new records. But despite all these formidable defenses, castles were eventually captured. Which brings us to the brutal, grinding reality of breaching defenses. Because sometimes, the only way in is through. Imagine the sheer, relentless effort required. It wasn't about one heroic charge. It was about weeks, months, sometimes even years of continuous, backbreaking, life-threatening work. Breaching a medieval castle was a multifaceted assault, often combining every single offensive method we've discussed, all working in concert like a very violent, very slow orchestra of destruction. One of the most direct ways to breach a wall was through sustained bombardment by trebuchets. While individual shots might not do much, hundreds, even thousands of impacts on the same section of wall could eventually cause it to crumble. It's like trying to break a brick wall with a series of really powerful, very angry golf swings. Eventually, something's going to give. Once a breach was made, even a small one, it would become the focal point of the assault. Soldiers would attempt to storm the gap, often in a chaotic, bloody melee, as defenders desperately tried to hold the line, fighting hand-to-hand in the rubble. This was a place where armor was tested, and courage was either found or utterly lost. Another method was the use of siege towers, enormous, mobile wooden structures, often taller than the castle walls themselves. These towers would be rolled up to the walls, filled with armed men who would then attempt to deploy a drawbridge onto the ramparts and flood the castle with attackers. Imagine a multi-story building on wheels, covered in leather, to resist fire, slowly trundling towards your home, packed with very angry, sword-wielding neighbors. It's a terrifying prospect. The defenders, of course, would desperately try to set these towers on fire with flaming arrows or throw large rocks from the battlements to topple them, scaling the walls directly. Using ladders or grappling hooks was perhaps the most desperate and suicidal tactic. It required incredible bravery, or perhaps foolishness, to attempt to climb a sheer stone wall while being shot at, stabbed at, and potentially doused with boiling oil. It was a high-risk, high-reward maneuver, often attempted under the cover of darkness or as a feint to draw defenders away from a main attack. You'd need to be part mountain goat, part ninja, and entirely comfortable with the concept of a very, very short lifespan. A mainstream historical fact. The siege of Constantinople in 1453 by the Ottoman Turks utilized a combination of massive cannons, some of the largest ever built at the time, relentless infantry assaults, and even tunneling to ultimately breach the formidable Theodosian walls. While not a medieval stone castle in the traditional sense, the scale of the defensive structures and the innovative breaching tactics employed demonstrated the ultimate triumph of overwhelming force and new technology over ancient defenses. It showcased that even the most legendary walls could fall when faced with sufficient determination and devastating firepower. Now, for a quirky tidbit, sometimes breaching wasn't just about smashing, it was about trickery. There are accounts of attackers pretending to retreat, only to launch a surprise attack on a different section of the wall once the defenders let down their guard, or using disguises, or even bribing a gate guard, though this was extremely risky and usually only attempted as a last resort. Imagine getting ready to celebrate a successful defense, only to realize the reinforcements walking through the gate are actually your enemies in borrowed uniforms. Talk about a rude awakening. And historians still argue whether the eventual fall of most medieval castles was primarily due to the sheer destructive power of improved siege engines, or if it was more often a result of internal factors like starvation, disease, or a collapse of morale that weakened the defense from within, making a breach inevitable. Was it the hammer, or the rot from the inside? It's like debating whether a tree falls because of a strong wind or because its roots were already weak. Either way, for the unfortunate souls involved, the moment of a breach was the chaotic, brutal climax of the siege, a final, desperate struggle for survival. You've witnessed the full spectrum of medieval siege warfare, from the meticulously planned defense to the desperate, brutal assaults. You've seen how these stony giants stood against relentless attacks, often for months or even years, making them truly formidable obstacles. But as the medieval period waned and new technologies emerged, the era of the seemingly impregnable castle began to slowly, inevitably fade. Which brings us to their enduring place in history, the castle legacy. while castles eventually succumbed to the advent of gunpowder. Artillery cannons that could consistently and effectively batter down even the thickest stone walls there. Impact on medieval society and warfare was profound and lasting. For centuries, they were the ultimate expression of power, control, and territorial dominance. They shaped landscapes, dictated trade routes, and were the literal centers of governance, justice, and community life. If you wanted to control a region, you built a castle. If you wanted to defy a king, you retreated to one. Think of the sheer architectural ingenuity that went into their design. Without modern cranes or computers, medieval builders constructed structures that have defied gravity, war, and the elements for half a millennium or more. The precision of their stonework, the cleverness of their defensive layering, the understanding of topography and logistics, it's frankly astonishing. They were engineering marvels, designed not just to withstand an attack, but to project an image of unassailable strength. And in that, they largely succeeded for a very long time. A mainstream historical fact. The decline of the great medieval castles as primary military strongholds really accelerated in the 15th and 16th centuries with the widespread adoption of large, powerful siege cannons. Cannons capable of delivering far greater kinetic energy than any trebuchet could create significant breaches in walls in a matter of days or even hours, rendering traditional castle designs increasingly vulnerable. The focus shifted from tall, thin walls to lower, thicker, angled fortifications that could deflect cannonballs, eventually evolving into star forts and other gunpowder defenses. It was less a graceful retirement and more a forced, noisy, and very smoky obsolescence. Now, for a quirky tidbit, even after their military usefulness declined, many castles didn't simply disappear. Some were converted into grand residences, their formidable walls becoming picturesque backdrops for stately homes and gardens. Others fell into ruin, becoming romanticized symbols of a bygone era, inspiring poets, artists, and countless fairy tales. And a few, like the Tower of London, continued to serve various purposes: prisons, armories, even zoos, adapting to the changing needs of society, a testament to their inherent robustness. Imagine your house being so well built that, after 500 years of living in it, someone decides to turn it into a historical petting zoo. That's a legacy Toe and historians still argue whether the romanticized view of medieval castles as symbols of chivalry and noble quests accurately reflects their true function as grim instruments of warfare and oppression, or if they're enduring. Aesthetic appeal justifies the more fantastical interpretations. Was their primary role to inspire fear or to inspire dreams? It's like debating whether a shark is a majestic creature of the deep or just a really efficient eating machine. Ultimately, medieval castles stand as powerful reminders of a tumultuous age, testaments to human ingenuity in both defense and destruction. Tonight, as you drift off, perhaps imagine those ancient stones still standing sentinel over centuries, whispering tales of sieges and surrenders, of bravery and despair. They remind us that even the most formidable barriers can eventually be overcome, but also that true resilience often lies not just in stone, but in the enduring spirit of those who defend it. Now, as the echoes of trebuchets and clashing swords fade, let your mind ease away from the clatter and dust of siege warfare. The grand, cold stones of the castles are quieting now, settling into their ancient slumber. Feel the gentle weight of your blankets, the soft pillow cradling your head. The battle is done, the alarms have ceased, and the long watch is finally over. Allow your breath to deepen, slowing, each inhale a sense of peace, each exhale a release of any lingering tension from our journey through time. The past has receded, leaving only the quiet comfort of the present moment. Let the calm surround you pulling you gently into the stillness of a deep, restful sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.